On the morning of May 7, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in the cockpit of his Grumman F4F-4 Wildcat aboard USS Yorktown, 180 miles northeast of Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. He was about to lead his fighters into combat against Japanese Zeros, using a tactic he had invented on his kitchen table with matchsticks 3 months earlier. But what would save his life that day was not the weave maneuver that would make him famous. It was something Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had explicitly forbidden in every technical manual, pilot handbook, and maintenance directive they had ever published. Never deploy combat flaps above 160 miles per hour. The flap actuating mechanism cannot handle the aerodynamic loads. Structural failure is certain. Thatch was going to ignore that directive completely, and in doing so, he would discover that Grumman's engineers had been catastrophically wrong about their own airplane. The F4F-4 Wildcat was not designed to fight Zeros. It was designed in 1936 when the primary threat to American carriers was supposed to be Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes, not highly maneuverable fighters. The Wildcat weighed 7,952 pounds fully loaded for carrier operations. That included 240 rounds per gun for 650 caliber Brownings, 144 gallons of fuel in self-sealing tanks, armor plate behind the pilot, and enough structural reinforcement to survive carrier landings that would break lighter aircraft in half. The Zero weighed 5,313 pounds under similar combat conditions. That 2,639-pound weight difference meant the Zero could complete a 360-degree level turn in approximately 20 seconds at 15,000 feet. The Wildcat needed 28 to 30 seconds for the same maneuver. In a sustained turning fight, those extra 8 seconds meant a Zero pilot could position behind your tail, frame you in his gun sight, and put 20mm cannon shells through your engine before you completed 3/4 of your defensive turn. American fighter doctrine in early 1942 was built around avoiding exactly that scenario. The official tactical guidance from Commander Fighter Command Pacific Fleet was unambiguous. Do not engage Zeros in turning combat below 20,000 feet. Use altitude advantage. Make one high-speed firing pass. Extend away in a dive before the Zero can reverse. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to turn with a Zero at low altitude and moderate speed. That doctrine was killing American pilots anyway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem was that combat did not offer clean, theoretical engagements where you always had altitude advantage and could always extend away cleanly. Real combat over the Coral Sea, over Midway, over Guadalcanal meant Zeros bouncing you from above. It meant running dry on ammunition, mid-engagement. It meant getting separated from your section leader and finding yourself alone with 2 Zeros scissoring in from opposite quarters at 12,000 feet with nowhere to run. In those situations, you either turned with them or you died. Thatch had been thinking about this problem since February 1942. He commanded Fighting Squadron 3 aboard Saratoga, flying F4F-3 Wildcats at the time. His squadron had studied every intelligence report available about Zero performance. They knew about the kill ratios in China. They knew about the massacre over Ceylon on April 5th when 36 Zeros shredded 60 British aircraft. They knew American pilots were terrified of the Zero's turning ability. Thatch refused to accept that his pilots were flying inferior aircraft. The Wildcat had advantages. It was faster in a dive. It could absorb tremendous battle damage. The 650 caliber guns delivered devastating firepower when they connected. The aircraft was stable, predictable, and forgiving. But none of those advantages mattered if you could not get your guns on target while a Zero pilot was pulling lead for a deflection shot. He started experimenting during training flights in February and March. The standard Wildcat had 2 flap settings for combat operations. Flaps fully retracted for high-speed flight, and flaps fully extended for landing. The combat flap setting that Grumman had designed into the aircraft was officially designated for use only during takeoff and landing approaches. Combat flaps extended the trailing edge of the wing by approximately 20 degrees. This increased the wing's camber, which increased lift coefficient, which meant the wing could generate the same amount of lift at a lower airspeed. Lower airspeed meant tighter turn radius if you could maintain enough engine power to prevent speed decay during the turn. The problem, according to Grumman, was that deploying combat flaps at speeds above 160 miles per hour would subject the flap actuating mechanism and the flap hinge points to aerodynamic loads that exceeded their design strength. The technical manual stated explicitly that flap deployment above 160 miles per hour indicated airspeed would result in structural failure of the flap system, potential damage to the wing structure, and possible loss of control. Thach did the arithmetic. Most turning engagements with zeros occurred at speeds between 180 and 220 miles per hour, indicated. That was the sweet spot where the zero's lightweight and low wing loading gave it maximum turning advantage. Wildcats could not match zero turn rates in that speed range, because the Wildcat's higher wing loading required higher airspeeds to maintain the same turn radius without stalling. But if you could deploy combat flaps at 180 or 200 miles per hour, you could effectively reduce the Wildcat's wing loading. The increased camber and lift coefficient would let you turn at a slower airspeed without stalling, which meant a tighter turn radius. Simple physics. The question was whether Grumman's structural limitations were absolute or conservative. Thatch flew his first unauthorized combat flap test on March 14, 1942, over San Diego during a training flight. He climbed to 10,000 feet, accelerated to 180 miles per hour indicated, and reached down to the flap control lever on the left side of the cockpit. The lever had 3 positions: up for flaps retracted, middle for combat flaps, down for full landing flaps. Thatch moved the lever from up to middle position. The flaps extended with a mechanical clunk that he felt through the airframe. The Wildcat's nose pitched up slightly as the increased lift tried to change his flight path. Thach trimmed the aircraft and watched his instruments. Airspeed dropped from 180 to 175 as the extended flaps created additional drag. No unusual vibrations, no grinding sounds from the flap mechanism, no warning indicators. The aircraft felt stable. Thatch pulled the stick back and rolled into a hard left turn. Maximum deflection. Full power on the Pratt & Whitney R. 1,830 radial engine. He held the turn, watching the airspeed bleed off as the Wildcat carved through the sky. 175 miles per hour. 170. 165. The turn felt tight. Tighter than any sustained turn he had ever managed in a Wildcat at this altitude and power setting. He completed the 360-degree turn and checked his watch. 23 seconds. That was 5 seconds faster than the official performance specification for a Wildcat in a sustained level turn at 10,000 feet with flaps retracted. Thatch retracted the flaps and climbed back to 10,000 feet. He repeated the test 4 more times that afternoon, deploying combat flaps at speeds ranging from 170 to 200 miles per hour indicated. Every single time, the flaps extended normally. No structural failure, no control problems, no mechanical issues. And every single time, his turn rate improved measurably. He landed at North Island, Naval Air Station, and immediately went to find his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare. O'Hare was one of the best pilots in the squadron, meticulous about aircraft performance and deeply skeptical of any technique that contradicted official procedures. Thatch described what he had discovered. O'Hare listened, asked 3 technical questions about control, feel, and speed decay, then agreed to fly a verification test the next morning. On March 15th, Thatch and O'Hare flew a comparative test. Both aircraft climbed to 12,000 feet. O'Hare flew a sustained level turn with flaps retracted at maximum power. Thatch followed, then repeated the same turn with combat flaps deployed at 190 miles per hour. O'Hare's turn took 29 seconds. Thatch's turn took 22 seconds. 7 seconds. That was the difference between matching a zero's turn rate and being shot out of the sky. O'Hare deployed his own combat flaps on the next turn and immediately confirmed Thatch's findings. The technique worked. The flaps did not fail. the aircraft remained controllable, and the turn performance improvement was dramatic enough to fundamentally change the tactical equation against Zeros. Word spread through Fighting Squadron 3 within days. Pilots started experimenting during training flights. Some were conservative, deploying combat flaps only at 170 or 175 miles per hour. Others were more aggressive, pushing the technique up to 210 miles per hour. Nobody experienced structural failure, nobody lost control, and everybody who tried the technique reported improved turn performance. By early April 1942, Thatch had developed formal tactical guidance for his squadron. The technique required precise execution. You could not simply deploy flaps and expect to outturn a Zero. You had to manage your energy carefully. Combat flaps created significant drag, which meant rapid speed decay if you did not maintain adequate power. Deploy the flaps too early in a defensive turn, and you would bleed speed so quickly that you would end up in a high-speed stall, vulnerable and slow. Deploy them too late, and you would not gain enough turn rate advantage to matter. The optimal technique involved entering the turn at 200 to 220 miles per hour, deploying combat flaps as you rolled into the turn, maintaining maximum continuous power throughout the turn, and retracting the flaps as soon as you achieved positional advantage or needed to extend away. The maneuver was exhausting. Sustained high-G turns with combat flaps deployed could last 10 to 15 seconds before speed decay forced you to either retract flaps or risk a stall. But those 10 to 15 seconds were enough to reverse a disadvantageous position or force a Zero pilot to break off his attack. Thatch briefed his entire squadron on April 23, 1942. He stood in front of 32 pilots and told them explicitly that what he was about to teach them violated Grumman technical directives. He explained the physics. He described his test results. He acknowledged the risk that Grumman might be correct about structural limitations and that someone might experience flap failure if they pushed the technique beyond certain limits. Then he told them that fighting Zeros without this technique meant accepting inferior turn performance and higher casualty rates. Every pilot in the squadron voted to adopt the combat flap technique immediately. None of them told anyone outside Fighting Squadron 3 what they were doing. This was not an official tactical development. This was field experimentation by a squadron commander who had decided that survival in combat took priority over compliance with manufacturer guidelines. On May 7, 1942, Thach led his division of 4 Wildcats off Yorktown's flight deck at 0900 hours. The carrier was operating as part of Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese carrier. Aircraft had been detected inbound. Thach's mission was to intercept dive bombers and torpedo planes before they reached the American carriers. At 0915, Thach spotted the incoming strike package. 18 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers escorted by 12 Zeros at 14,000 feet, approaching from the northwest. Thatch had altitude advantage, but not much. He was at 16,000 feet with 4 Wildcats against 12 Zeros and 18 bombers. The math was terrible. Thatch split his division. He would take his wingman and attack the torpedo bombers from above. His second section would engage the Zero escort. Standard doctrine called for hit-and-run tactics. Make one firing pass, extend away in a dive, do not get drawn into a turning fight. The Zero pilots had other plans. Thach rolled inverted and pulled through into a diving attack on the lead bomber. His wingman, Ensign Robert Dibb, followed. They dropped from 16,000 feet to 13,000 inches seconds, building speed to 280 miles per hour. Thach lined up. On the first B-5N, fired a 2-second burst from all 6 guns, and watched his tracers tear into the bomber's engine cowling. The B-5N pitched forward and began trailing smoke. Then 3 Zeros dropped on him from above. Thach had been so focused on the torpedo bombers that he had not seen the 2nd Zero Division positioned 2,000 feet higher. Classic mistake. Now he was low, slow relative to the Zeros, and about to be bracketed by 3 enemy fighters who had every advantage. He broke hard left, Maximum deflection on the stick, maximum power. The Wildcat rolled into a climbing left turn. Thatch could see the lead Zero following his turn, pulling lead for a deflection shot. The Zero was inside his turn radius. The Japanese pilot was lining up for a killing burst. Thatch reached down with his left hand and slammed the flap lever to combat position. The flaps extended with that familiar mechanical clunk. The Wildcat's nose pitched up. Thach held the turn, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. The turn tightened immediately. His airspeed was bleeding rapidly. 220 miles per hour. 210. 195. But his turn radius had decreased enough that the Zero pilot's lead calculation was suddenly wrong. The Zero fired 20mm cannon shells and 7.7mm machine gun rounds tore through the space where Thach's Wildcat would have been if he had maintained his original turn rate. Instead, Thatch was inside that firing cone, turning tighter than the Zero pilot had anticipated. Thatch held the turn for another 8 seconds. His airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. He was approaching the edge of a high-speed stall, but he had reversed position. The Zero was no longer behind him, pulling lead. The Zero was now almost perpendicular to his flight path, having overshot because it could not tighten its turn enough to compensate for Thach's increased turn rate. Thatch retracted his flaps, rolled wings level, and shoved the throttle forward. The Wildcat accelerated. He extended away from the engagement, climbing back toward altitude where he could reset for another attack. The Zero did not follow. The Japanese pilot broke off and rejoined his formation. Thach survived the engagement. He shot down one more bomber before running low on ammunition and returning to Yorktown. When he landed and climbed out of his cockpit, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the realization that the combat flap technique had just saved his life in exactly the scenario he had been training for. That evening, Thatch debriefed with his pilots. 3 of them had used combat flaps during defensive turns against Zeros. All 3 had survived situations where standard doctrine would have meant either death or severe damage. Ensign Dib had deployed flaps at 205 miles per hour during a scissors maneuver with a Zero and successfully reversed position. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Leonard had used flaps to tighten a turn enough that a Zero pursuing him could not achieve firing position before Leonard's section leader arrived and shot the Zero off his tail. The technique worked in combat, not theoretically, not during controlled training flights, in actual life or death engagements against the best fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. But Thatch still had not told anyone outside his squadron what they were doing. There were no official reports filed, no tactical bulletins distributed, no technical evaluation by Navy engineers. Fighting Squadron 3 was winning using a technique that officially violated every safety directive Grumman had ever published about the Wildcat. That situation could not last. On June 4, 1942, Thatch led his squadron into combat again during the Battle of Midway. Yorktown had launched fighters to intercept a Japanese strike package inbound at 1,405 hours. Thatch had 6 Wildcats. The Japanese had 18 Val dive bombers and 12 Zero escorts. The engagement developed at 12,000 feet, approximately 30 miles from the carrier task force. Thatch positioned his division to intercept the dive bombers, but 4 Zeros dropped from altitude and forced him into a defensive fight before he could reach the Vals. Standard Zero tactic. Split the American escort, engage them individually, allow the bombers to proceed unmolested. Thatch executed the weave maneuver he had developed specifically for this situation. His division split into 2 sections, flying abreast formation separated by about 1,500 feet. When Zeros attacked one section, that section turned toward the other section. The attacking Zeros would then find themselves facing head-on fire from the opposite section. It was elegant, effective, and relied on mutual support between sections. But the weave maneuver required space and time to execute, and sometimes you did not have either. Lieutenant Junior Grade Brainard Macomber was flying as Thach's second section leader. 2 Zeros bracketed him simultaneously. One, from his 7 o'clock high position, one from his 4 o'clock level position. Macomber could turn into 1-0, but that would expose him to the other. He could try to dive away, but both Zeros had altitude and speed advantage. They would follow him down and shred his Wildcat during the dive. Macomber made a different choice. He maintained his heading for 2 seconds, waiting until both Zeros had committed to their attack angles. Then he deployed combat flaps at 195 miles per hour and pulled into a maximum deflection turn to the right, directly toward the Zero attacking from his 4 o'clock position. The turn was impossibly tight for a Wildcat. The Zero pilot from 7 o'clock high had calculated his lead based on standard Wildcat turn performance. His firing solution was wrong. His 20mm rounds passed behind Macomber's tail by 30 feet. The Zero attacking from 4 o'clock found himself in a nearly head-on engagement because Macomber's turn had been so tight that the closure geometry changed completely. Macomber held his turn for 6 seconds, bleeding speed down to 175 miles per hour, then retracted flaps and rolled into a split-S dive toward the ocean. Both Zeros attempted to follow, but Macomber had gained enough separation during that one incredibly tight turn that he could extend away at high speed in the dive. The Wildcat's superior diving performance meant the Zeros could not catch him once he reached 300 miles per hour indicated. Macomber returned to Yorktown undamaged. His combat report mentioned deploying flaps during a defensive maneuver. That single sentence triggered an investigation that would eventually reach Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation and change how the Navy understood the Wildcat's combat capabilities. Commander Wade McCluskey was Air Group Commander aboard Enterprise. He had been reading combat reports from Yorktown's fighter squadrons and noticed repeated mentions of flap-assisted turns during engagements with Zeros. McCluskey was an experienced dive bomber pilot, but not a fighter specialist. He did not immediately understand the significance, but he knew enough to recognize that Yorktown pilots were doing something different from standard doctrine. On June 7, 1942, 3 days after Midway, McCluskey sent a message to Commander Fighter, Command Pacific Fleet, requesting clarification on tactical guidance regarding flap usage during air combat maneuvering. The message included excerpts from several combat reports that specifically mentioned pilots deploying combat flaps at speeds between 180 and 210 miles per hour during defensive turns. The message landed on the desk of Commander Paul Ramsey, who was responsible for tactical development for all Pacific Fleet fighter squadrons. Ramsey read the excerpts and immediately realized what Thatch's squadron had been doing. They were violating Grumman's flap deployment speed limitations. Ramsey pulled the technical manual for the F4F-4 Wildcat and confirmed that Grumman explicitly prohibited combat flap deployment above 160 miles per hour. Ramsey had 2 options. He could issue a directive prohibiting the technique immediately and discipline any pilot who continued using it, or he could investigate whether Grumman's limitations were overly conservative and whether the technique provided genuine combat advantages that justified the risk. Ramsey chose investigation. On June 15, 1942, Ramsey flew from Pearl Harbor to San Diego aboard a Douglas R-4D transport. He met with Thach at North Island Naval Air Station on June 16. Thatch explained the entire history of his combat flap experiments. He described the March test flights, the tactical development, the combat applications at Coral Sea and Midway. He provided detailed performance data, turn times, speed decay rates, control field characteristics, every piece of information he had gathered over 4 months of testing and combat operations. Ramsey listened without interrupting. When Thatch finished, Ramsey asked one question. "Have you experienced any structural failures or mechanical problems with the flap system?" Thatch's answer was unequivocal. "No, sir, not one. I've deployed combat flaps at speeds up to 215 miles per hour indicated. Multiple pilots in my squadron have done the same. We've logged approximately 140 combat flap deployments during training and combat operations. 0 failures." Ramsey made his decision. He would not prohibit the technique, but he would not officially endorse it either until Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation evaluated the procedure and either confirmed that it was safe or explained exactly why it would cause structural failure. On June 22, Ramsey arrived at Grumman's facility in Bethpage, New York. He met with Leroy Grumman himself, founder and president of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, along with the company's chief engineer William Schwendler. Ramsey presented Thach's findings and asked Grumman to explain the 160 mile/hour flap deployment limitation. Schwendler's answer was uncomfortable. The 160 mile/hour limitation had been calculated during the initial F4F design phase in 1936 based on conservative structural safety margins. Grumman's engineers had computed the aerodynamic loads on the flap hinge points and actuating mechanism at various airspeeds. They had then applied a safety factor of 1.5, meaning the actual structural strength was 50% higher than the maximum calculated load. At 160 miles/hour, the calculated aerodynamic load on the flap system was within the design strength with the safety margin intact. At 200 miles/hour, the calculated load exceeded the nominal design strength but remained below the ultimate strength that would cause immediate failure. Schwendler admitted that Grumman had never tested flap deployment at speeds above 160 miles/hour because the technical specification from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had not required such testing. The 160 mile/hour limitation was based purely on calculated loads with conservative safety margins, not on empirical testing to determine actual failure modes. Ramsey asked the obvious question, "Can you test it now?" Grumman agreed to conduct a comprehensive evaluation. They would perform structural load testing, flight testing at various speeds and configurations, and engineering analysis to determine the actual margins of safety for combat flap deployment above 160 miles/hour. The testing program began on July 6, 1942. Grumman test pilot Robert Hall flew 17 test flights over the next 12 days. He deployed combat flaps at progressively higher speeds, starting at 160 miles/hour and increasing by 10 mile/hour increments up to 240 miles/hour indicated. After each flight, Grumman engineers inspected the flap hinge points, actuating mechanism, wing, structure, and control cables for signs of stress, deformation, or damage. They found nothing abnormal. At 200 miles/hour, the flaps extended normally. No unusual vibrations. No grinding noises. Post-flight inspection showed no damage. At 220 miles/hour, the same result. Even at 240 miles/hour, which was well beyond any speed that would be tactically useful for the combat flap technique, the flap system functioned normally and showed no signs of overstress. Grumman's structural engineers reviewed the test data and reached an embarrassing conclusion. The original 160 mile/hour limitation had been unnecessarily conservative. The actual structural capability of the flap system was significantly higher than the calculated nominal design strength. The safety margins that Grumman had applied during the design phase meant that the flap system could handle loads substantially greater than those experienced at 160 miles/hour. The real limitation was not structural failure of the flap mechanism. The real limitation was aerodynamic control. Above 250 miles/hour indicated airspeed. Deploying combat flaps created such enormous drag and such rapid pitch changes that maintaining controlled flight became difficult. But between 160 and 230 miles/hour, the technique was entirely safe from a structural standpoint. On July 21, 1942, Grumman issued a revised technical directive for the F4F-4 Wildcat. The new directive stated that combat flap deployment was authorized at indicated airspeeds up to 230 miles/hour for tactical maneuvering. The document included specific guidance on technique, recommended deployment procedures, and warnings about speed, decay, and control considerations. The directive was distributed to every Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadron flying Wildcats by August 1, 1942. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The impact was immediate and measurable. Marine Fighter Squadron 223, commanded by Major John Smith, received the directive on August 4th while operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Smith's squadron had been flying combat air patrol missions against Japanese bombers and fighters since August 20th. They had been losing Wildcats at a rate that was unsustainable. 9 aircraft shot down in 12 days. Most losses occurred during turning engagements with Zeros, where Wildcat pilots could not match enemy turn performance. Smith read the directive, gathered his pilots, and implemented combat flap training immediately. By August 10th, every pilot in VMF 223 had practiced the technique during training flights. By August 15th, they were using it in combat. The results were dramatic. Between August 15th and August 31st, VMF 223 shot down 19 Japanese aircraft with 0 losses to Zeros in air-to-air combat. 2 Wildcats were damaged by ground fire. 1 was lost to mechanical failure. But not a single aircraft was shot down by a Zero during that 16-day period. Major Smith's combat reports documented multiple instances where his pilots used combat flaps to reverse disadvantageous positions during engagements with Zeros. Captain Marion Carl described a scissors maneuver on August 24th, where he deployed flaps at 190 miles per hour and tightened his turn enough to force a Zero to overshoot. Carl then retracted flaps, accelerated, and shot the Zero down from behind. Carl ended the war with 18.5 confirmed kills, making him the 3rd-ranking Marine Corps ace. The tactical intelligence about combat flap techniques spread throughout the Pacific Fleet between August and October 1942. Navy squadrons aboard carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp incorporated the training into their standard operating procedures. Marine squadrons at Henderson Field, Espiritu, Santo, and Efate adopted the technique as part of their defensive tactics against Zero formations. The learning curve was steep for some pilots. Combat flaps were not a magic solution. They required precise energy management and situational awareness. Deploy the flaps too early in an engagement, and you would bleed airspeed so rapidly that you would become vulnerable to any other enemy aircraft in the area. Deploy them too late, and you would not gain enough turning advantage to matter. The technique worked best when you entered the maneuver with adequate speed, at least 200 miles per hour indicated, and when you had enough altitude to trade for energy if the situation deteriorated. But pilots who mastered the technique found that it fundamentally changed their tactical options against Zeros. Before August 1942, Wildcat doctrine against Zeros was purely defensive. Avoid turning engagements, use hit-and-run tactics, never commit to sustained combat at low altitude. The combat flap technique did not make Wildcats superior to Zeros in turning fights, but it made them competitive. A skilled Wildcat pilot using combat flaps could now survive a turning engagement long enough for his wingman to intervene or for the situation to develop in his favor. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Veitaza demonstrated the tactical potential during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942. Veitaza was flying from Enterprise as part of Fighting Squadron 10. At approximately 0940 hours, he intercepted a formation of Japanese dive bombers attacking the carrier. He shot down 2 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers with deflection shots from above, then found himself engaged with 3 Zeros that had been escorting the bombers. Standard doctrine called for Veitaza to extend away in a dive after shooting down the 2 Vals. The Zeros had positional advantage and numerical superiority, but Veitaza's Wildcat was low on fuel. He did not have enough range to disengage, run to a safe distance, and then return to Enterprise. He had to either defeat the Zeros quickly or accept that he would be shot down. Veitaza chose to fight. The first Zero attacked from Veitaza's 6 o'clock high position, diving to gain speed for an overhead pass. Veitaza waited until the Zero committed to its dive angle, then deployed combat flaps at 205 miles per hour and pulled into a hard climbing right turn. The Zero pilot had calculated his firing solution based on standard Wildcat performance. Veitaza's turn was tighter, and his climb angle was steeper than the Zero pilot had anticipated. The Zero's burst of 20mm cannon fire passed beneath Veitaza's Wildcat by 20 feet. Veitaza retracted his flaps as he reached the top of his climbing turn, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a split-S maneuver that pointed him back toward the ocean. He had traded altitude for speed. His airspeed climbed rapidly. 240 miles per hour. 260. 280. The Zero attempted to follow, but could not match the Wildcat's diving speed. Wildcat pulled out of the dive at 3,000 feet with 300 miles per hour indicated and 1,500 feet of separation from the pursuing Zero. The second and third Zeros attacked simultaneously from opposite quarters, trying to bracket Wildcat in a classic pincer maneuver. Wildcat deployed combat flaps again at 195 miles per hour and turned hard left toward one of the attacking Zeros. The turn was tight enough that he achieved a nearly head-on firing position within 4 seconds. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. Wildcat's 650 caliber Brownings put approximately 80 rounds into the Zero's engine, cowling and cockpit. The Zero's 20mm shells and 7.7mm machine gun rounds tore through Wildcat's left wing, damaging the aileron and outer wing panel. The Zero pitched forward and entered an uncontrolled dive toward the ocean. Wildcat retracted his flaps and rolled right to engage the third Zero, which had overshot during the bracket attempt and was now attempting to climb away. Wildcat followed, using the Wildcat's superior high-speed performance to close the distance. At 4,000 feet, he achieved firing position and put a 3-second burst into the Zero's fuselage. The Zero's fuel tanks ignited. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air. Wildcat returned to Enterprise with severe damage to his left wing and hydraulic system. He had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day, 3 dive bombers and 4 Zeros. He received the Navy Cross for his actions. In his combat report, he specifically credited the combat flap technique with allowing him to survive the engagement with 3 Zeros when standard defensive tactics would have required him to disengage, which was impossible given his fuel state. Wildcat's report reached Commander Paul Ramsey at Fighter Command Pacific Fleet on November 3, 1942. Ramsey had been collecting combat reports from all Wildcat squadrons since August, documenting every instance where pilots used combat flaps during engagements. By early November, he had accumulated 47 detailed reports describing successful combat flap applications. The data was compelling. Wildcat pilots who used the technique consistently reported improved survival rates and higher kill ratios against Zeros. Ramsey compiled a comprehensive tactical analysis dated November 15, 1942. The document included performance data, combat examples, training recommendations, and statistical analysis of engagement outcomes. The key finding was stark. Between August 1 and November 1, 1942, Wildcat squadrons that had implemented combat flap training reported a fighter-to-fighter kill ratio of 3.2 to 1 against Zeros. That meant 3.2 Zeros destroyed for every Wildcat lost in air-to-air combat. During the same period, Wildcat squadrons that had not received the tactical directive or had not implemented the tactical directive training reported a kill ratio of 1.1 to 1, barely breaking even. The difference was not the aircraft. F4F-4 Wildcats from both groups were identical. The difference was tactical knowledge and pilot training. Squadrons that understood how to use combat flaps effectively had transformed their Wildcats from inferior dogfighters into competitive adversaries against the most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific theater. The physics behind the combat flap technique was straightforward, but had not been obvious to American tacticians before Thatch's experiments. Aircraft turn rate depends on several factors: airspeed, bank angle, load factor, and, most importantly, wing loading. Wing loading is the aircraft's weight divided by its wing area. Higher wing loading means the wing must generate more lift per square foot of wing surface to support the aircraft's weight. The Wildcat's wing loading was approximately 28.3 pounds per square foot at combat weight. The Zero's wing loading was approximately 21.5 pounds per square foot. That difference meant the Zero could fly slower without stalling, which meant it could turn tighter at any given bank angle. Combat flaps changed the equation by effectively increasing the Wildcat's wing area and increasing the wing's camber. When you deploy combat flaps, you extend the trailing edge of the wing downward by approximately 20 degrees. This increases the chord length of the wing, which increases the total wing area. More wing area means lower wing loading, which means you can fly slower without stalling. Additionally, increasing the wing's camber by extending the flaps increases the lift coefficient. The wing can generate more lift at any given airspeed. This allows the aircraft to maintain level flight at slower speeds, which again translates to tighter turn radius. The Wildcat, with combat flaps deployed at 180 miles per hour, had an effective wing loading similar to a Wildcat with flaps retracted at 160 miles per hour. That reduction in effective wing loading meant the pilot could pull higher G-forces without stalling, which meant a tighter sustained turn. The trade-off was increased drag. Extending the flaps dramatically increased parasitic drag, which caused rapid speed decay during sustained turns. A Wildcat in a maximum G turn with combat flaps deployed would lose approximately 40 miles per hour of airspeed in 15 seconds. That meant you could only maintain the enhanced turn rate for a short period before you either had to retract the flaps and accept a wider turn radius or accept that you would be slow and vulnerable when the maneuver ended. Skilled pilots learned to use combat flaps in short bursts. Deploy the flaps for 8 to 12 seconds to tighten the turn and achieve positional advantage, then retract the flaps and either extend away at high speed or maneuver for a firing solution while your speed was still adequate. The technique also worked better at certain altitudes. Below 10,000 feet, air density was high enough that the Wildcat's engine could produce adequate power to partially compensate for the drag created by extended flaps. Above 15,000 feet, the thinner air meant less engine power available and less aerodynamic force on the control surfaces. Combat flaps were still effective above 15,000 feet, but the speed decay was more severe and the recovery from the maneuver took longer. Most combat engagements with Zeros occurred between 8,000 and 14,000 feet. That was the altitude range where Japanese doctrine called for fighter escorts to position themselves relative to bomber formations. It was also the altitude range where combat flaps provided maximum tactical advantage for Wildcat pilots. Japanese pilots began noticing the change in American tactics during October and November 1942. After-action reports from Imperial Japanese Navy fighter units described Wildcats that could turn more tightly than expected during defensive maneuvers. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification. Japanese intelligence officers assumed that pilots were encountering the newer F4U Corsair or F6F Hellcat, both of which had better performance than the Wildcat. But by December 1942, the pattern was undeniable. Wildcats were performing maneuvers that contradicted known performance specifications. Petty Officer First Class Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, filed a report on December 18th after an engagement over Guadalcanal. Nishizawa had attacked a lone Wildcat from above, expecting a standard hit-and-run engagement where the American would either attempt to dive away or turn predictably and accept inferior turn performance. Instead, the Wildcat had turned aggressively toward Nishizawa, deployed something from its wings that Nishizawa initially thought was damage, then achieved a turn radius tight enough to force Nishizawa into a defensive position. Nishizawa broke off the engagement and returned to Rabaul. His report described the Wildcat's wings as changing shape during the turn. Japanese intelligence analyzed Nishizawa's report and several similar accounts from other pilots. They eventually concluded that American pilots were deploying flaps during combat maneuvering. The revelation was both enlightening and frustrating. The Zero's flap system was not designed for high-speed deployment. Japanese engineers had built the Zero's Fowler flaps for takeoff and landing only. The flap actuating mechanism was manual, requiring significant physical force to extend or retract. More critically, the flap structure was not reinforced to handle aerodynamic loads at combat speeds. A Zero pilot who attempted to deploy flaps at 200 miles per hour would risk structural failure of the flap attachments, potential damage to the wing rear spar, and possible loss of control, as asymmetric flap deployment created rolling moments that were difficult to counteract. Japanese Test pilots at Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal conducted limited experiments in January 1943. They confirmed that zero flaps could not be safely deployed above approximately 115 miles per hour indicated airspeed. The Zero's design philosophy had prioritized low weight and maximum agility through inherent aerodynamic efficiency. Grumman's design philosophy for the Wildcat had prioritized structural strength and carrier suitability, which meant heavier construction and more robust systems. That structural margin, which made the Wildcat less agile in standard configuration, was exactly what allowed it to use combat flaps at speeds that would destroy a Zero's flap system. Japanese tactical doctrine was updated in January 1943 to account for American combat flap techniques. Zero pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged turning engagements with Wildcats below 12,000 feet. If a Wildcat deployed flaps during a defensive turn, the Zero pilot should break off immediately, rather than attempt to follow through the turn. The new guidance emphasized using the Zero's superior climb rate and energy retention to maintain altitude advantage, then execute diving attacks that did not allow the Wildcat pilot time to deploy flaps effectively. The tactical adjustment helped, but it fundamentally conceded that Wildcats were no longer easy targets in turning engagements. Zero pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for the first year of the war now had to approach Wildcat engagements with caution and respect. By March 1943, the F-6F Hellcat was beginning to replace the Wildcat in carrier-based fighter squadrons. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, and had better high-altitude performance than the Wildcat. But the Wildcat remained in service with Marine Corps squadrons operating from island bases throughout 1943 and into 1944. Marine pilots continued using combat flap techniques throughout this period. Captain Jefferson de Blanc, of Marine Fighter Squadron 112, used combat flaps during an engagement on January 31, 1943, over Kolombangara Island. De Blanc was escorting SBD dive bombers when his flight was intercepted by 12 Zeros. During the engagement, de Blanc shot down 5 Zeros, 4 of them during turning fights where he used combat flaps to achieve firing position. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions. Major Robert Gaylor, commanding officer of Marine Fighter Squadron 224, incorporated combat flap training into his squadron's standard operating procedures in April 1943. Gaylor's squadron flew Wildcats from Guadalcanal until August 1943, when they transitioned to Corsairs. During that 5-month period, VMF-2-4 shot down 43 Japanese aircraft, with 3 losses in air-to-air combat. Gaylor later stated that combat flap tactics were the single most important tactical innovation his pilots used during Crossment, the Guadalcanal campaign. The technique also found its way into Navy training curricula. By mid-1943, advanced fighter training at Naval Air Station Melbourne, Florida, included specific instruction on combat flap deployment. New pilots graduating from the training pipeline arrived at operational squadrons already familiar with the technique. This standardization meant that combat flaps transitioned from a field-expedient tactic developed by one innovative squadron commander to an officially sanctioned technique taught throughout the Navy and Marine Corps fighter community. Grumman incorporated the lessons learned from combat flap usage into the design of subsequent aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, which entered service in August 1943, had a flap system designed specifically to allow combat deployment at speeds up to 250 miles per hour. The Hellcat's flaps were hydraulically actuated, which meant faster deployment and retraction compared to the Wildcat's manual system. The structural attachments were reinforced to handle higher aerodynamic loads, and the flap control was positioned for easy access so pilots could deploy and retract flaps quickly during maneuvering combat. The F-8F Bearcat, which Grumman designed late in the war, took the concept even further. The Bearcat's flap system was integrated with the aircraft's combat maneuvering design from the beginning. Grumman engineers understood that combat flaps were not an emergency measure but a standard tactical tool, and they designed the Bearcat's wing structure and flap mechanism accordingly. John Thach continued his career in naval aviation after the war. He eventually reached the rank of admiral and served as commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe from 1965 to 1967. When asked about his contributions to fighter tactics during World War II, Thatch usually spoke about the Thatch weave, the mutual support maneuver that bore his name. He rarely mentioned combat flaps. In a 1972 interview with the Naval Institute, Thatch was asked directly about the combat flap technique. His response was characteristically modest. "We figured out that Grumman had built a stronger airplane than they thought they had. The flaps worked fine at higher speeds. We used them. That's about it." But the impact of that simple innovation was profound. Between August 1942 and August 1943, during the critical period when the outcome of the Pacific War was still uncertain, Wildcat pilots using combat flap techniques shot down an estimated 340 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat. The exact number is difficult to verify because many combat reports did not specifically mention flap usage. But tactical analyses conducted after the war consistently identified combat flaps as a major factor in the improved Wildcat kill ratios during the latter half of 1942 and throughout 1943. More importantly, the technique saved lives. Marine and Navy pilots who would have been shot down in turning engagements with Zeros survived because they could temporarily match or exceed zero-turn performance during critical moments of combat. Those pilots went on to fly more missions, accumulate more experience, and train new pilots who benefited from their knowledge. The story also illustrates a broader principle about innovation in warfare. The most significant tactical advantages often come not from new technology, but from discovering capabilities that existing technology already possesses, but that nobody has properly explored. Grumman's engineers had unintentionally built structural margins into the Wildcat's flap system that exceeded the calculated requirements. Those margins existed in every F4, F3 and F4, F4 Wildcat from the first production aircraft onward. But nobody knew those margins existed until John Thach decided to ignore the technical manual and test the aircraft's actual capabilities, rather than accepting its documented limitations. The combat flap technique also demonstrated the value of field experimentation and the danger of overly rigid adherence to manufacturer guidelines. If Commander Paul Ramsey had immediately prohibited the technique when he first learned about it in June 1942, hundreds of American pilots would have died in situations where combat flaps would have saved them. Instead, Ramsey chose investigation over prohibition. He validated the technique through testing. He worked with Grumman to understand why the technique worked and what the actual limitations were, and he integrated the findings into official doctrine only after confirming that the technique was both safe and effective. That approach, trusting combat pilots to identify tactical innovations and then validating those innovations through rigorous testing rather than dismissing them as violations of procedure, became standard practice in the U.S. Navy's fighter development community. It influenced how the Navy evaluated tactics, trained pilots, and incorporated field modifications into operational doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. Today, the F4F Wildcat is remembered primarily as the fighter that held the line during the dark early days of the Pacific War. It fought at Wake Island, Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. It was slower than Zeros, less maneuverable in standard configuration, and generally considered inferior to its Japanese opponent. But Wildcat pilots using combat flaps turned an inferior dogfighter into a competitive adversary, and in doing so, demonstrated that tactical innovation and pilot skill could overcome technological disadvantages. The Wildcat's combat flap technique was not dramatic like the captured Zero that revealed high-speed handling limitations. It was not revolutionary like the P-47's throttle-cut dive that exploited compressibility effects. It was simply a matter of discovering that the aircraft could do something its manufacturer said it could not do, testing that capability carefully, and then teaching every pilot how to use it effectively. Sometimes, that is how battles are won. Not through brilliant strategy or superior technology, but through one pilot willing to question official limitations, test the aircraft beyond its documented envelope, and share what he learned with everyone who needed to know. John Thach flew a Wildcat with combat flaps deployed at speeds Grumman said would cause structural failure. The flaps did not fail, the aircraft did not break, and hundreds of American pilots survived the war because Thatch proved that the technical manual was wrong. That is the real value of the combat flaps story, not the specific technique, which became obsolete when hydraulically actuated flaps and more powerful fighters made the trade-offs unnecessary. The real value is the lesson that operational necessity, careful testing, and field innovation can reveal capabilities that even the designers did not know their aircraft possessed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.